Hey there, kiddos. So, like it says on the top of the notes, today we're focusing on China's Golden Age, so the Tang and Song dynasties in China. This is for those of you who this helps with, this is for our class for doing this on the 30th. So, we're going to be investigating China's reemergence on the world scene. From the ashes of the Han Dynasty, China was able to become re-centralized, contributing to its emergence as one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the world. To help us understand this process, we're going to focus on these three questions. So, first, how did China become re-centralized, and how did this lead to China's Golden Age? Second, why is this time period considered a Golden Age for China? And then lastly, how did this Golden Age affect China's relationship with outsiders? To get us started with this, we need to go back and review a little bit of Chinese history. We haven't talked about China in a little while, and the last time we discussed China was in reference to the Han Dynasty. Now, we discussed the Han Dynasty collapsing for a few reasons. They were being invaded by the Xiongnu, and the Xiongnu were demanding this tribute in return. Because of that, the Chinese had to raise taxes on peasants. This became really expensive, and eventually it led to a revolt, the Yellow Turban Rebellion in China, and the Han Dynasty was never able to recover. So the Han Dynasty collapses in around 220 CE. Alright, so that's the first step. The Han Dynasty collapses, and afterwards there's over 300 years of decentralization. In China. And again, decentralization is the opposite of centralization. So basically that means that there's no longer one government controlling the entire territory in China. So we have a bunch of different smaller kingdoms that are competing with one another, trying to gain power, and that leads to this long period in which China is no longer an empire. Finally, China becomes re-centralized once again with the rise of the Tang dynasty, or the Tang. I think technically I always call it the Tang because I'm from the north and that's how we pronounce things. So re-centralizes once again with the rise of the Tang dynasty in 618 CE. CE. That's an 8, by the way, in my goofy handwriting. And this period, basically from the beginning of the Tang Dynasty all the way until 1279, which we will find out has to do with the Mongols. So this period, 618 to 1279, is known as the Golden Age in China. So think to yourself once again, what does it mean to have a Golden Age? We discussed this in reference to the Islamic Caliphates a couple days ago. So if you need to, look back in your notes, pause the video if you need to, but think back, what does it mean to have a Golden Age? Alright, so a Golden Age is a time when there's a thriving in the arts, in literature, and in science due to the relative prosperity and peace that's happening at that time. So the Caliphate's experiencing a golden age around this time, so is China. So this is a really good time for a lot of places. Now, the next thing that we want to focus on is this idea of how did China become re-centralized? So coming up to this first question here. And really, this comes down to the fact that the Tang Dynasty, like the Han, it models its government on Confucian principles. And if you think back to the Han Dynasty, this idea of basing your government on Confucian principles comes down to a couple things, but really it's all based on the ideas of good government, so basically effective government. Sorry, my computer screen just disappeared. Good government by being led by effective leaders, and knowing one's place in society. So if you think about it, this idea of good government and effective leaders, this relates to the idea of being junsi, right? To be junsi means that you are well educated, that you are able to put the interests of other people in front of your own interests, and so basically you're unselfish. And according to Confucius, you want those people leading the government, which is why they come up with they don't come up with, but they, once again, emphasize the civil service exams. These civil service exams where in order to become part of the bureaucracy, to make it into the government, you had to pass this test and prove your effectiveness, prove your ability to serve the empire well. And the idea here is that these well-qualified officials will contribute to an effective government. Right? And basically, because of this centralization, I mean, this whole thing works. During the Tang Dynasty, or the Tang Dynasty, sounds so British. During the Tang Dynasty, this government becomes incredibly effective, incredibly stable, and this stability leads to, again, I wrote too much, this stability leads to a great deal of innovation. In the society. Because if you think about it, people tend to not take risks when they're worried about just having food for the next day. I'm not worried about trying to invent some new thing if I don't have shelter for my family. So basically the fact that the government is so effective and is able to meet people's needs, well, because we're no longer worried about those needs, we're able to focus on other things like coming up with some new form of math, like algebra in the caliphate, or whatever it may be. So in the case of China, this brings us to this idea, this second question up here, of why is this time period considered a golden age for China? And the first part of this comes down to the amazing inventions, the amazing things that the Chinese were able to create in this time period. One of which is the printing press, and that's what you're seeing in that first picture. That first picture there. The printing press. If you think about it, before the printing press was invented, if you wanted to gain access to knowledge, if you wanted to study something that people had written down in the past, you had to go to a book, and books were located in libraries. But it's not like today where, every branch of the Houston Public Library has access to thousands and thousands of books. Back then, every single book had to be hand-copied. So if you wanted to get access to knowledge, you had to find the 1, 2, 3, maybe one of the five copies of a book that existed in the entire world. So being able to have, it's kind of hard to see on here, but being able to have, what they would do is they would carve these wooden blocks out, and each block would have essentially like a letter or a word on it. And you could rearrange those different blocks to make a message, write a story, have an announcement, or something like that. And what they would do, I'm going to turn on my camera so you can see me. Hey, all right. So what they would do is they would put ink on the top of those blocks, and then they would take, I'm trying to see if I don't have tools. All right, whatever. They would take paper and smack it on top of those blocks, put another piece of paper on, smack it on, and it would print those pages onto the pieces of paper that they're smacking onto the inked up blocks that were there. So by our standards, it was still really slow in terms of printing, but by their standards, as opposed to handwriting everything, it was incredibly fast. And because of this, because they're able to copy these books much more quickly, those books are much more affordable. They're much cheaper to produce. So really huge deal. The next major invention, I'm having trouble showing all this because the page is running into the document camera. There we go. The next major invention is gunpowder. By the way, I'm just talking over these, but you probably want to write down a couple of the ideas we're discussing in terms of these. Gunpowder. So, gunpowder was first used well, first it was supposed to be a medical thing, but then they realized that you can set it on fire and blow things up. And the Chinese quickly adapted this to use it as a weapon. At first, they would, is that the right one? Yep. So at first they would put a bunch of gunpowder inside of a ball, put it on a catapult, launch that ball, light it on fire, launch that ball over at the enemy, and when it landed, it would explode. And more than anything, this was a psychological weapon. It wasn't nearly as dangerous as like our modern day artillery shells or anything like that, but it was an incredible psychological weapon on the battlefield. Eventually, they turned it into this. And so this is one of the world's first rocket launchers. And they would put all this gunpowder inside of a rocket, light it on fire, and because they could direct the explosion out the back of the rocket, it would shoot off that way, and they could direct it exactly where they wanted it to go. And so these pods, they could just light a bunch of rockets, aim it at the enemy, and it would shoot off at the enemy and blow up when it got there. This last one is a little bit harder to see what it is, but it's the compass. Now the compass is one of the most important inventions in this time period because, compasses work by pointing to magnetic north. And so regardless of where you are, if you turn it and you know how to use it, you can figure out which direction you're moving in. And if you have really good maps, then you can use the compass